Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine Cuba's deepening infrastructure crisis as energy, fuel, and water shortages begin to reinforce one another. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at Hungary's election result and what it means for political stability, the limitations of temporary ceasefires in Ukraine, and a series of security developments, including school shootings in Turkey, ongoing negotiations between the United States and Iran, and a suspected Islamic State-linked attack in Algeria. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover labor unrest in northern India and the early emergence of a high-intensity typhoon in the North Pacific. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Cuba's ongoing shortages are increasingly affecting critical national infrastructure. During the period from April 9th to 16th, Cuban officials and international media reported a further worsening of the country's ongoing crisis. On April 10th, the Havana Electricity Company reported rolling outages of up to 18 hours in parts of the capital. Similar figures were also reported in other cities across the island. The current electricity, fuel, and infrastructure crisis has led to a further decline in Cuba's tourism sector, which had previously served as a key lifeline for the economy. On April 13th, Iberia Airlines announced that it would suspend direct flights to Cuba from June, citing a drop in tourist demand. Iberia is the latest airline to halt services to the island, following similar announcements from several other carriers in late February and early March. Those decisions were also influenced by fuel shortages and declining demand. Also, on April 13th, U.S. President Donald Trump reiterated threats to carry out a military operation to topple the Cuban government, stating that we may stop by Cuba after we're finished with Iran. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Cuba's energy and infrastructure crises have likely entered a negative feedback loop. Shortages of energy, water, and fuel are accelerating the deterioration of critical national infrastructure. In turn, this is leading to more prolonged disruptions and compounding secondary impacts. On April 10th, local authorities in the town of Matanzas, home to one of Cuba's key thermoelectric plants, reported that electricity generation is being continuously compromised by rising levels of oil theft from transformers. The stolen oil is then reused as fuel for small generators. Authorities have also reported widespread theft of solar panels. In the same area, the lack of drinkable water has led to an increase in the digging of improvised wells. However, these wells carry a higher risk of cross-contamination from sewage. This is contributing to further shortages in access to clean water, as well as a spike in waterborne diseases, which in turn is placing additional strain on local healthcare services. Following the U.S. military operation to capture Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro, which resulted in the suspension of Venezuelan oil exports to Cuba, there has been an island-wide increase in the use of locally extracted oil. However, this oil is classified as both heavy and sour, meaning it has a very high sulfur content and is highly corrosive. It is also more difficult to process and transport and less efficient for power generation. This substitution has accelerated the degradation of power-generating infrastructure. Increased corrosion of equipment, along with greater particulate buildup, has raised both the rate and scale of breakdowns and outages. Cuba's energy situation is likely to worsen further in the short to medium term, with environmental factors expected to play a significant role in the coming months. In May, daily maximum temperatures are likely to exceed 30 degrees Celsius. In addition to increasing water consumption, higher temperatures are also likely to reduce the efficiency of power plants, and, more broadly, the efficiency of electricity transmission across power lines. Decreased efficiency is likely to coincide with increased demand, driven by ventilation and refrigeration needs. This will place further strain on the power grid and increase the likelihood of cascading failures. Moreover, the Caribbean hurricane season typically begins in June, with a realistic possibility of powerful storms as early as May. High winds, flooding, and storm surges are likely to damage power plants, substations, and transmission infrastructure, while also disrupting fuel supplies. This will exert additional pressure on Cuba's energy production. The resulting decrease in energy availability is likely to exacerbate pressures across other critical national infrastructure sectors, including drinking water provision, telecommunications, and access to healthcare. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Hungary's elections have resulted in a decisive shift in power after more than a decade. On April 12, Hungarian citizens voted to elect the 199 members of the National Assembly. The vote, largely a contest between the incumbent Fidesz party of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and the opposition TISA party led by Péter Magyar, was convincingly won by the latter. TISA received 54.4% of the vote, compared with Fidesz's 37.7%. Due to Hungary's electoral law, which heavily favors winning parties, TISA secured 68% of the total seats. This amounts to a two-thirds supermajority, potentially granting it the ability to implement constitutional reforms. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The days immediately preceding the vote were marked by significant levels of disinformation, along with ungrounded accusations of electoral fraud. Both Fidesz and TISA established hotlines for voters to report alleged irregularities. Despite this, once the initial results were published, Orbán quickly conceded defeat, likely due to the clear gap between the two parties. In his victory speech, Magyar called on President Tamás Sulyok and other state officials to resign. He described the Orbán government as a regime and pledged to reverse Fidesz's encroachment within state institutions. Magyar's victory is likely to be well received in Brussels, as Viktor Orbán's government had positioned itself as a political roadblock on key foreign policy issues, including the war in Ukraine. Magyar's early comments suggest he will likely remove Hungary's veto on the EU's planned €90 billion loan to Ukraine, a key lifeline for Kiev. Ukrainian policymakers have warned that, without the pledged European funds, the country could face a $50 billion budget shortfall by May. For Magyar, a priority in pursuing a reset with the EU will be to unlock the €18 billion in funding currently frozen by Brussels due to Orbán's domestic policies. He is also likely to seek expanded access to EU defence and development programmes. In the short term, the clear electoral result is likely to reduce the chances of large-scale political unrest. However, Hungary is likely to continue facing high levels of disinformation, as Moscow, which had in the Fidesz government a key regional ally, may intensify hybrid operations to destabilize the new administration. Moreover, moves by the TISA government to erode Fidesz's presence within state institutions could prompt accusations of overreach and authoritarianism, potentially triggering public backlash. Overall, Hungary is likely to remain politically unstable in the medium term. Internal political polarization, sustained disinformation efforts, and institutional tensions between the new government and entrenched Fidesz supporters are likely to drive continued friction, increasing the risk of unrest and institutional paralysis. Staying in the region, a short Easter ceasefire in Ukraine has highlighted the challenges of implementing any lasting pause in fighting. On April 9th, the Kremlin unilaterally announced that Russian forces would observe a 32-hour Orthodox Easter ceasefire. The move followed Ukrainian proposals for an Easter ceasefire, with Kyiv subsequently stating that its forces would abide by the declared pause. Despite Ukraine having shifted the observance date for Christmas away from the Orthodox date observed in Russia, Its Eastern Rite churches continue to observe Easter on April 12th. Kiev publicly pushed to extend the ceasefire beyond the specified timeframe, but Moscow rejected the proposal. A 175 for 175 prisoner exchange did take place. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov sought to present the Easter ceasefire as a humanitarian gesture. In the hours leading up to the ceasefire, Russian forces launched 160 one-way attack drones against Ukraine. During the ceasefire itself, Ukraine's general staff reported a total of 7,696 Russian violations. These included 1,355 shelling incidents, 115 assaults, and 6,226 drone strikes. On the morning of April 12th, Russia's defense ministry claimed that Ukrainian forces had committed 1,971 violations. Now our intelligence team's assessment. It is highly likely that the 2026 Easter ceasefire followed the same pattern of failure as previous temporary Russo-Ukrainian ceasefires, as it lacked even minimal arrangements for credible implementation. The January 2023 Orthodox Christmas truce was immediately contested. The March 2025 ceasefire on energy infrastructure targeting was marked by repeated mutual accusations of violations. Similarly, the equivalent Easter truce in April 2025 ended in reciprocal accusations of violations. The shared factors across these temporary ceasefires have been a lack of clearly defined prohibited activity, the absence of independent and credible monitoring, and no meaningful penalties for non-compliance. Where more robust ceasefire mechanisms have previously been in place during the war, such as the July 2020 Donbas ceasefire, which was monitored by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, levels of violence did fall sharply. However, that ceasefire took place before the full-scale invasion in February 2022, which significantly altered the dynamics of the conflict. The defects in ceasefire implementation are made more acute by the saturation of drones across the Ukrainian battle space. More easily observed heavy artillery may significantly reduce fire missions, as was likely seen during the Easter ceasefire in April 2026, despite some alleged violations, but first-person view drone strikes continue at high rates. This is particularly pertinent given the high proportion of casualties now resulting from drone strikes along the Ukrainian front lines. Ukraine's armed forces claim that 96% of Russian casualties in March 2026 were caused by drones. In addition to the almost certain widespread violations of these ceasefires, shaped by the lack of verification and enforcement mechanisms, unmonitored ceasefires are also almost certainly intrinsically vulnerable to information warfare. The competing publication of tallies with precise figures is likely aimed at audiences such as Washington, in order to condition favorable behavior and to demonstrate to the international community the opponent's unreliability. For example, the Kremlin likely exploited the energy ceasefire in March 2025 within the information space to influence Washington to reduce support for Kiev, portraying Russia as a cooperative actor at a time when US support for Ukraine was waning. The repeated failures of these unmonitored ceasefires almost certainly highlight, first, the challenges that would need to be overcome in any hypothetical conflict-wide ceasefire designed to be durable. Second, these failures underline that any future ceasefire announcements should be factored into travel risk assessments with increased caution and skepticism. Ceasefires may not serve as a reliable indicator of a materially reduced threat environment, especially along a line of contact that extends beyond 1,000 kilometers, in a war defined by complex multi-domain operations across land, air, maritime, cyber, and information environments. Future ceasefire agreements should only be considered credible where independent, externally verified monitoring and enforcement mechanisms are in place, alongside a sustained cessation of active fighting. Also in the region, 2 consecutive school shootings in Turkey point to a growing threat from emerging forms of violent extremism. On April 13th, an individual opened fire with a shotgun on students at a high school in the Siverek district near the Turkey-Syria border, injuring 16 people. On the following day, another school shooting occurred in Kahramanmaraş, in southern Turkey near the Mediterranean coast. This second attack resulted in at least 9 deaths and more than 20 injuries. Both attacks were reportedly carried out by teenagers. The Siverek attacker was said to be 17 or 18 years old, while the Kahramanmaraş attacker was 14. In both cases, the perpetrators died by suicide before police arrived at the scene. Turkish authorities have not yet determined the official motive behind the attacks. However, on April 16th, officials reported that the Kahramanmaraş shooter had referenced an incel terrorist on his social media profiles. The term incel, short for involuntary celibate, refers to a set of extremist beliefs characterized by extreme misogyny. Several attacks have been linked to this ideology, including the 2014 Isla Vista shooting in the United States, which killed 6 people. Now our intelligence team's assessment. There is a realistic possibility that the 2 attacks form part of a broader, increasingly prominent trend of school shootings and stabbings carried out by children or teenagers. These incidents fall within the category of so-called nihilistic violent extremism, or NVE. This term, adopted by the FBI in 2024 to describe a growing number of school attacks in the United States, refers to extremism that is not driven by any specific ideology, but rather by a desire to carry out violence for its own sake. Attackers often display behaviors similar to other lone actors, such as writing manifestos and spreading propaganda online. However, they tend to draw freely from a range of ideological frameworks without adhering to a specific or coherent belief system beyond a broad misanthropic outlook. On platforms such as Telegram and Discord, nihilistic extremist communities idolize American school shooters, including the perpetrators of the 1999 Columbine attack, as well as ideologically motivated attackers from a range of backgrounds, including neo-Nazism, incel beliefs, and Islamism. Their actions are often viewed as templates to be emulated. Nihilistic violent extremism first emerged in the United States and other English-speaking countries following the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions. Cases then expanded rapidly into non-English-speaking countries during 2024 and 2025. Since 2024, NVE-linked arrests or attacks have been reported across a range of countries, including Italy, Germany, and other EU states, as well as Asian countries such as Indonesia and Singapore, and Latin American countries like Mexico. The phenomenon has likely transcended cultural, socioeconomic, and religious boundaries, further complicating efforts to define or attribute a coherent ideology. Because of its ambiguous and poorly defined nature, unlike jihadist or far-right extremism, most states lack comprehensive legal and security frameworks to counter this form of violence. This likely increases the threat posed by NVE in the short to medium term, as individuals and networks do not consistently follow identifiable ideological or operational patterns, making detection and disruption more difficult. Turning to the Middle East, a fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran remains in place, despite difficult negotiations. The 2-week ceasefire, agreed late on April 7th, remains in effect and is due to expire on April 21st. Despite an initial lag in implementation, with attacks continuing at high rates, only isolated attempted attacks, excluding Lebanon-Israel, have been recorded at much lower levels since April 8th. Some of these incidents have been attributed to Iran-backed proxy groups in Iraq. For example, on April 11th, Bahraini reports stated that a drone was intercepted over Bahrain, after which both Bahrain and Saudi Arabia summoned an Iraqi envoy. On April 11th, the United States began engaging in Pakistan-mediated talks with Iran. However, on April 12th, the talks ended without an agreement. According to a U.S. official, Iran did not accept several red lines set by President Donald Trump's administration. These included an end to all uranium enrichment, the dismantling of major enrichment facilities, and the removal of the country's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Iran also reportedly refused to end funding for proxy militant groups across the region, and did not agree to fully open the Strait of Hormuz without imposing a toll on passage. On April 12th, President Trump stated on social media that the United States would begin blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz after Iran allegedly failed to open it. The U.S. blockade of the strait came into effect on April 13th, with advisories issued by international maritime authorities. The measures are reportedly targeting Iranian or Iran-linked vessels, as well as ships departing Iran with cargo. Sources indicated on April 14th that a second round of post-ceasefire talks may take place later in the week, with U.S. officials suggesting that further direct in-person discussions are likely before the ceasefire expires. A Pakistani delegation visited Tehran on April 16th, while calls and exchanges of draft proposals have reportedly continued remotely between the United States and Iran. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Despite the failure of the Islamabad post-ceasefire talks to produce a peace agreement, neither side has declared an end to negotiations or to the ongoing two-week truce. Both Iran and the United States almost certainly remain incentivized to continue talks in the immediate term. However, the ceasefire remains highly fragile and could break down rapidly, with little warning. President Trump's imposition of a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, targeting Iranian or Iran-linked vessels, almost certainly raises the risk of miscalculation that could trigger renewed escalation. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has warned that any miscalculated move will trap the enemy in the deadly whirlpools in the strait, underscoring the potential for a rapid and dangerous deterioration in the situation. Further strikes originating from Iran remain possible despite the ceasefire, or even in the event of its extension should a second round of post-ceasefire talks materialize. Iranian chains of command have almost certainly been structured to endure decapitation strikes, granting significant autonomy to local commanders and units to act unilaterally on predetermined orders. However, this degree of independence has likely increased the risk of Iranian units continuing to launch missiles and drones despite the ceasefire. Tehran could also leverage plausible deniability for lower-level attacks to apply pressure in ongoing negotiations. Any such strikes would likely be lower in volume and intensity compared to those conducted outside the current ceasefire conditions. The alleged low-scale continuation of drone attacks, such as the reported incident targeting Bahrain on April 11th, most likely originated from Iran-backed proxy forces in Iraq. Proxy groups, including Iran-aligned militias within Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, are highly likely to provide Tehran with a means of sustaining pressure while maintaining plausible deniability for breaching the two-week ceasefire. The ceasefire almost certainly remains highly unstable, with the ongoing conflict in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah standing out as one of the most prominent factors that could trigger its collapse. Tehran has repeatedly threatened to withdraw from the agreement if Israeli attacks continue, while Israeli officials have reiterated their position that operations against Hezbollah are not covered by the ceasefire. A potential second round of direct talks would highly likely encounter the same key divisions in negotiating positions. Tehran is unlikely to be under sufficient pressure to compel compliance with demands that cross its established red lines. However, this does not preclude the possibility that President Donald Trump's administration may conclude that the costs of the war have become too great, and that a more limited agreement, acceptable to Tehran, but likely unacceptable to regional actors such as Israel and Saudi Arabia, will be necessary. Such a deal would most likely involve movement by Tehran limited to the nuclear file, without constraints on its ballistic missile capabilities or significant concessions regarding its support for regional proxy forces. If a ceasefire extension is not agreed in the coming days, ahead of April 21st, there is a high likelihood that kinetic activity will return to pre-ceasefire levels. All parties have likely used the pause in fighting to improve both offensive and defensive positions. In response to the reduction in high-intensity strikes inside Iran, military units have likely regrouped, dispersed remaining assets, and repositioned forces to enhance survivability against future attacks, while accelerating efforts to restore operational effectiveness. If hostilities resume, Iran will likely be in a stronger position to conduct large-scale attacks against Israel and other regional targets. All parties are also highly likely to maintain high-tempo intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance operations, including aggressive reconnaissance flights and drone activity. These efforts are intended to identify and track high-value targets, ensuring an advantageous position in the event that hostilities resume. Elsewhere in North Africa, a botched double suicide bombing in Algeria marks the first major attack in the country in nearly a decade. On April 13th, 2 individuals reportedly detonated person-borne improvised explosive devices in the town of Blida, around 45 kilometers southwest of Algiers. The first explosion occurred near a local police station, with the second taking place roughly 500 meters away. Both attacks failed after police reportedly identified the assailants, prompting them to detonate their explosive belts prematurely. The blasts caused several injuries, but no civilian fatalities. The incident coincided with the arrival of Pope Leo XIV in Algeria for a state visit, the first such papal visit to the modern Algerian state. In the aftermath, authorities implemented a widespread media blackout, while local independent outlets reported dozens of arrests of individuals accused of sharing information about the attacks. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The double suicide bombing marks the first major terrorist attack in Algeria in almost a decade, excluding the 2020 bombing in Timiaouine, a town on the Algeria-Mali border. The last wave of attacks in the country occurred in 2017, with several operations, including one in Blida, carried out by Islamic State. These incidents coincided with the acceleration of the group's territorial decline in its strongholds in Syria and Iraq. No group has claimed responsibility for the attack. However, several factors, including the location, timing, and relatively sophisticated methods, make it likely that it was planned, or at least coordinated, by actors affiliated with Islamic State, possibly linked to its Sahel province. This assessment is further supported by several considerations. First, Islamic State operatives have repeatedly sought to assassinate Pope Francis, Leo's predecessor, during state visits, including reported attempts in Iraq and Indonesia. This reflects the group's ongoing interest in maximizing visibility for its actions, and an attack in Blida may have been intended to attract significant international attention. Second, Islamic State's Sahel province has grown considerably in both territorial reach and operational strength over the past 3 years. In doing so, it has increasingly penetrated North African countries bordering the Sahel, including Morocco and Algeria, using them to facilitate the movement of fighters and resources. An attack in Blida would therefore likely serve to demonstrate the group's expanding regional footprint. Over the past 2 years, several ISSP-directed plots have been thwarted across North Africa. For example, in February 2025, Morocco dismantled a 12-person cell organized by the group that was planning suicide bombings across the country, and has since carried out dozens of arrests of individuals attempting to travel to the Sahel to join it. Finally, it is comparatively less likely that the attack was carried out by al-Qaeda, the main rival of Islamic State in the region. While Islamic State Sahel province operates within the group's broader global caliphate project, making an attack on the Pope both ideologically and strategically coherent, Al-Qaeda has instead focused on promoting the local and regional expansion of its affiliate groups. In North Africa and the Sahel, this more pragmatic approach has been reflected in organizations such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, the latter currently considered Al-Qaeda's strongest global affiliate. A high-profile attack targeting the Pope or other international figures would therefore likely be counterproductive for Al-Qaeda, as it could draw increased international attention to the Sahel and raise the risk of retaliation. Further stops on Pope Leo's visit to Africa include Angola and Equatorial Guinea, countries that face a considerably lower threat from Islamic State and other Islamist militant groups, as well as Cameroon. Cameroon, by contrast, has a localized presence of several Islamist groups, including Boko Haram and, to a lesser extent, another Islamic State affiliate, Islamic State West Africa Province. These groups are primarily active in the far north region, which is not included in the Pope's planned itinerary. However, even if unable to attempt further major attacks in Algeria, there is a realistic possibility that jihadist militants may increase the volume of attacks within their existing areas of operation to coincide with the papal visit. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, labor protests in northern India are becoming increasingly volatile amid rising cost-of-living pressures. On April 13th and 14th, protests turned violent as they entered their fourth and fifth days in the hosiery complex in Phase 2 of Noida, in Uttar Pradesh. The demonstrations involved approximately 40,000 workers from multiple companies within the large industrial township who were demanding higher wages. Workers blocked key roads, torched vehicles, and threw stones at police, who had moved in to disperse the crowds. Police responded with tear gas as confrontations intensified, and 396 people were arrested, according to Indian national media. Starting in Phase 2 and Ecotech 3, workers reportedly moved towards Sector 15, where they blocked a key intersection, raising concerns that the protests could spread across the wider industrial hub of Gautam Buddh Nagar. The Uttar Pradesh government has agreed to a temporary wage increase of 21% for workers in Noida and Ghaziabad. However, workers maintain that this rise is insufficient given the continued increase in living costs. On April 15th, similar protests took place across parts of Haryana, with factory workers blocking roads and clashing with police. Workers called for the implementation of a promised 35% increase in minimum wages, following similar demonstrations the previous week. Several international and domestic vehicle manufacturers have production facilities in Haryana. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Noida is a designated special economic zone in India, hosting numerous multinational corporations, major domestic firms, and a growing number of technology and manufacturing companies. Companies with a presence in Noida include HCL Tech, Paytm, Samsung, Microsoft, Adobe, and Deloitte, among many others. Significant unrest there would likely have wider implications. The growing number of labor protests in northern India suggests that further demonstrations are highly likely to emerge across additional provinces. There is a wide regional disparity in wages across the country, with Delhi remaining the only area where wages across all worker categories have doubled since 2016. Uttar Pradesh is now the second state to raise minimum wages, following Haryana. The increase of up to 21% almost certainly sets a visible precedent for workers in nearby industrial zones, raising the risk of further protests spreading to other provinces. This issue is becoming increasingly stark as living costs rise, driven in part by the US-Israeli war on Iran and the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, which has pushed up oil prices. Approximately 30% of India's crude import routes depend on the strait. Russia became India's largest crude supplier in 2023, accounting for around 39% of its crude and condensate imports, up from just 2.5% in 2021. Despite this only partial exposure to price increases linked to disruption in the Strait, India is almost certainly experiencing broader cost pressures. These rising costs will highly likely place additional strain on lower-paid workers, increasing the likelihood of further unrest. Local officials have stated that certain outside elements may have incited violence after the initial protests began to subside. Uttar Pradesh Labour Minister Anil Rajbar has indicated that agencies are exploring possible links to Pakistan-based handlers. It is likely that the identification of Pakistan-linked outsider elements or the continuation of protests will fuel significant sectarian tensions. If conditions continue to deteriorate, this could potentially trigger anti-Pakistan or anti-Muslim protests across major cities. And finally, in the North Pacific, Typhoon Sinlaku's early season intensity may signal a more active and disruptive storm season ahead. On April 14th, Super Typhoon Sinlaku, a Category 5 equivalent storm, made landfall on Saipan, the largest of the Northern Mariana Islands. The system first developed as a low-pressure area on April 8th, before steadily intensifying from April 11th. The typhoon caused widespread disruption across Saipan, Rota, and Tinian, including flooding, infrastructure damage, and power outages. By April 15th, the system had moved away from the area. According to meteorological agencies, Sinlaku is one of the strongest storms recorded so far this year, reaching estimated 1-minute sustained winds of 295 kilometers per hour. It is also one of the few typhoons of this intensity to form so early in the year, and the second Category 5 equivalent system of the season, following Typhoon Horatio in February. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The typhoon is notable for forming well before the peak of the Pacific typhoon season, which typically runs from June to November, although tropical cyclones can occur year-round in the western North Pacific. The year 2026 has already seen several notable early-season systems. Typhoon Nokayan, which formed on January 15th, was the first named storm to develop in that month since 2019. While early season activity alone is not a definitive predictor of overall seasonal intensity, the development of multiple high-intensity systems at this stage increases the likelihood of a more active or volatile typhoon season. This could elevate environmental and disaster risk levels across the Pacific, with low-lying and infrastructure-constrained island territories likely to face greater exposure. Beyond the immediate impacts, repeated storm activity may compound recovery challenges, place strain on emergency response capacity, and contribute to longer-term economic disruption. The European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts has linked early-season tropical cyclone activity to projections indicating an increased likelihood of El Niño Southern Oscillation conditions developing in 2026 to 2027. El Niño events are typically associated with shifts in global atmospheric circulation patterns. These include lower precipitation and higher temperatures in regions such as the western coast of North America, Australia, and parts of southern and central Africa, as well as India. At the same time, they are linked to increased precipitation and heightened storm activity in parts of the Middle East and South-Central Asia. More broadly, El Niño conditions tend to coincide with elevated global temperatures, which can exacerbate existing environmental pressures. These shifts may have secondary impacts on food production, water availability, and energy demand, particularly in countries with lower resilience or a high dependence on climate-sensitive sectors. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.